So I'm a little bit of an odd duck here because I'm an anthropologist, not a journalist, but because of the nature of my work, I certainly had access to a lot of computer hackers who were doing very interesting, sometimes illegal things, but also accessing information that was used by journalists. And I ended up writing kind of semi-journalistic pieces and a big book. I was also in some ways a source, or what I sometimes call the gopher. I was the person who could link journalists to computer hackers. And it was both beneficial to me because it helped me justify my work among anonymous, and I was able to kind of translate between the hacker world and the journalistic world. It also put me in a little bit of a tough position sometimes because my allegiance is more to the people I study than the public interest. And so there was moments where I actually wasn't keen on necessarily giving information to journalists, but there were other moments where I was keen to do so either because the people I was working with wanted that information relayed, or it was a good time to kind of have that happen. So I think I might provide an interesting perspective as well, because of the fact that I was this kind of broker or gopher between the journalistic world and the hacker world. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I think also another interesting element, and this might also really pertain to you and other journalists, when you work in an area for a very long time and there's sources, first of all, you are going to be accused of being an informant, possibly. I certainly was accused of being an FBI informant or a CIA agent. And, I understand why. When you embed yourself in a world for 25 years, it kind of makes sense to have those rumors pop up. And one of the things we might want to talk about is how you mitigate or dampen those rumors. I think another element that is also very interesting too is that there's probably informants in your midst as well, if you're doing long-term work with sources. In my case, that was certainly the case, where one of the main hackers who had been involved in Anonymous, his name was Sabu, and it was eventually revealed that he was an informant, and we can talk about why we know he was an informant, because most informants we don't know about until decades and decades later. He sought me out, and he became a very interesting source, but he was clearly fishing for information from me, and I had information about other sources as well. And I was very well aware of the fact that even though when I was interacting with him, I didn't know he was an informant, he could be an informant, right? So it's also, I think, really brings home this point of how you silo information between people. And relatedly, again, this may not, I think it pertains to journalism as well, but anthropology too. Sources have their own agenda as well, right? And this is something that journalists are very aware of, and it's no different for anthropologists either. And I think navigating that terrain where they're trying to kind of push your agenda on you is also something that I'd love to talk about, because I definitely have experienced that in very different ways among the hackers I've worked with. Just very briefly, I've done a lot of work with Anonymous, so there was this period of time where I was this gopher, where I gophered between hundreds of journalists and Anonymous. Currently, I'm working on a very different project in France, where an intelligence organization in the 1990s was very interested in recruiting hacker talent when they didn't have any. And they infiltrated the hacker scene, created a fake hacker association, the French CCC, the Chaos Computer Club. And I'm working with a journalist now to tell that deeper history. And it's been really, really interesting cultivating those sources, because the statute of limitations have passed, and so people are they're a bit more willing to talk about it, but reputations are still very much on the line as well.
Okay,
So.
I mean, just before we move on, I might just ask you one question. You've looked at anonymous as one example, and that's an example of a phenomenon which is a honeypot of data, information, acquired by some anonymous organisation or source, and a load of people, journalists, who are a little bit anxious about how it was acquired, but are still desperate for the information.
Right.
All right? You've been like an intermediary. So how do you think the journalists have handled themselves? And what is your, since you've got a room full of mostly journalists here, what are the kind of lessons from that?
Sure. I'll answer briefly, but I have actually written a whole piece about this because it was so interesting to interact with about 300 journalists that in the end I was like, wow, I'm going to write about this. And the experiences were variable, from shockingly bad, usually from extremely mainstream press media, with people, for example, from ABC being like, I need the Julian Assange figure of anonymous, which is ridiculous because that's not how they operate, to people I worked with incredibly closely in order to break stories, right? And certainly those journalists who were willing to put in time and research fared a lot better. So who here, for example, that works in the digital realm has been on internet relay chat? Okay. So that was incredibly, incredibly important. Internet relay chat is a little bit like Slack. Who here has been on Slack? Okay, so more people.
Who here knows what Slack is?
So
I was just going to say, who here knows what Slack is?
right.
Slack.
Who here knows what Slack is? Okay. So they're like chat rooms. And in order to talk to Anonymous when I was studying them, if you weren't a journalist who was willing to learn how to get on IRC, I was probably not willing to broker with you, just because that's what you needed to do to access them. And so those that were willing to learn that, which was actually not that hard to do, I was more willing to engage with those journalists. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there was added protections of how you were going to protect yourself when you interacted with people online. But that was a really good example of, are you willing to kind of learn the technical ropes to get into these worlds?
Okay, there's the technical ropes. What about the kind of rules of engagement? Did you make them agree something before you?
No, I did not.
Okay, and did they have to promise to protect the identity of these anonymous people, or was there any kind of deal made with the sources?
I mean, this is the interesting thing about the anonymous world is that the people who were engaging in that world were already anonymous, and in some ways it was a little bit incumbent on them to protect themselves, right? And certainly, and we can talk about how they were caught as well, which is very, very interesting. Interestingly enough, it never had to do with a journalist. They did their kind of own mistakes.
Right.
But one of the tough parts, the really tough part, is that you couldn't verify who these people were. And that often is incredibly important, right, for journalism. Is to be like, who is this person? Whereas there were just certain claims being made. And it was actually only because of the arrests that certain claims were able to be verified. So there's a kind of limit of what you could learn when people are pseudonymous unless they give you documents, right? And they certainly do give you documents. And this was an interesting thing. I'll give one quick story. So one of the things that Anonymous did, prior to the anonymous era, it was really uncommon for hackers to hack into an organization, take documents or emails, and publish them online. It happened, but very rarely. And I have a whole genealogy about that. And so then the question is, are you comfortable taking those emails, right? And in my case, I was not, actually. So Jeremy Hammond is one of these anonymous hackers. He broke into a company called Stratfor. Right around Christmas 2011, he finds me. Again, I don't know who he is, but we have a good relationship.
Right.
And
so he found you before WikiLeaks, is that right?
This is before he gives it to WikiLeaks.
Got it, okay.
He offered it to me, And he not only offered it to me, but he offered it to me right around the time he was hacking into Stratfor to delete the rest of their files. So he was also doing sabotage. And he was like, I'm about to RF, which is the Unix technical command of like, I'm going to delete all these files. And I was like, holy shit. And I thought he was an informant maybe, and he was trying to entrap me in terms of like having me support him. And because of this case around Barrett Brown, who's going to be here tomorrow, like a journalist can be thrown in jail for taking these emails. I mean, that's the really scary part. So I was like, Jeremy, or I didn't know if he was Jeremy. He was called like O or Ghost. I was like, I'll wait until they're published to see them. But this is probably something you would all love to get, right? So the question is, what's the best mechanism to get those emails in a way that protects you as well as the source?